Welcome to Appetite for Life. My name is Carson Patton. I'm the Events and Programming Manager here at the UNC Nutrition Research Institute. We're in Kannapolis, North Carolina, for those joining online. So we have people here with us today, and we're super glad to have you here in person, and very thankful for our people that are joining virtually as well. So today's program, Nutrition Myths, Fact versus Fake, focuses on one of the most common challenges in health and wellness, sorting the credible nutrition information from misinformation. So we're pleased to welcome Dr. Katie Meyer today. Dr. Meyer is a nutritional and cardiovascular disease epidemiologist whose research examines how diet and health behaviors influence cardiometabolic disease risk. So her work explores connections between nutrition, the gut microbiome, and long-term heart health, with a focus on improving prevention strategies across the lifespan. For those joining virtually, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A throughout the program, and for those in person, we'll have time to address all the questions at the end. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
We could also take questions. I'm going to be showing some pictures, data pictures, and so if you have questions, please raise a hand. So you'll notice I changed the title a little bit to include fact, fake, or other. I also just want to thank everybody for coming. Thanks to the Zoomers. And I would also like to thank the great, the awesome NRI teams who helped put this together, especially the advancement team who worked on making these slides as pretty as they are and improving the display enormously. So this is my second time talking about giving a talk on nutrition myths. And because I'm so focused on my research just tirelessly, I always have to Google, like, what's going on? What are the myths out there? And so these are just some of the top hits off of a search. And you can see that there's no shortage from all kinds of, we have the NIH weighing in, Mayo Clinic, we have major news sources, and then we have the Food Network and some other health-related websites. And so this, I want to acknowledge Anju, who is here. She is a bioinformatician, made this really beautiful chart distilling the information from these. You have 17 myths, 10 myths, some of these, just read the language. Myths experts wish would die. 10 myths dietitians hate the most. So it's quite strong language. And what we saw when we did this was that there were some common themes, and we also put a bunch of one-offs in this. I don't know why this is in this category called one-offs. And one gem in the one-offs is actually what I selected to talk about today. And that myth is fundamental nutrition advice keeps changing a lot. And I picked this one. We will be talking a little bit about carbohydrates and dietary fats. Those both were pretty prominent. But I think this myth is pretty central to our field and kind of the health of our field, because I think people, there can be a fair amount of frustration with the field of nutrition. You keep hearing one thing, then the other. And so I just want to talk a little bit about this. Fundamental nutrition advice keeps changing a lot. And it's always important in these myths, there are always these key words. So this, I would say, because there are some fundamental, I think, changes that have happened. I also want to start off by thinking about what do we mean by myth? Because I think, it's one definition, it's a widely held but false idea or belief. I would probably lean more towards a definition along it's a misrepresentation of the truth or maybe a simplification of what we know to be more complicated. Often the myths are presented quite strongly and as an absolute when we know that there's still much unknown, or when we know that the truth is more complicated. Welcome, welcome, honorable. So I want to start off by why is there so much confusion about nutrition and diet? And I'm sure there are other reasons, but these are just some. And I actually scrawled a note just 5 minutes before the talk. I came up with one more. First of all, there is no one healthy diet. So these are data from the mid-50s, 60s, from a very early study called the 7-country study. And these investigators went to different parts of the world and recruited participants. So every country has a cohort, a group of individuals, and they assessed their diet, and then they followed them up for cardiovascular disease events. And what you can see here on the y-axis is the rate of coronary deaths. So, you know, the higher up the country, the more coronary deaths there were per capita. And on the x-axis, you have the percent of diet calories from total fats. And so what you see here, just to highlight, I guess, can I use this? Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you see Japan here, 10% total calories from fat, very low coronary death rate. And then you also have Crete, Greece, 40% calories from fat, and even lower, but probably within the margin of error. But nonetheless, you know, the Japanese diet and the Greek diet, especially, you know, in the 50s, they were very different, right? You can imagine. And this is before a lot of the transfer of foods to a more uniform kind of Western diet. And so I think that is one key thing. And this chart is interesting, and I don't want to focus on the tiers, the red, you know, too much, because this is the American Heart Association taking their 10 components of what they've determined are important aspects of a healthy diet. And then they've gone through a variety of other diets, including the DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet. These are vegetarian, variants of vegetarian, pescatarian. So they have fish. Here they have eggs and milk, and and dairy. And what you see here is just that aside from some specific things, so in the Mediterranean diet, there's really no limit on alcohol, or there's not kind of a statement about alcohol, and there's not a statement about salt specifically in the Mediterranean diet. But aside from a couple of things, you can just see that most of these diets, very different diets. The DASH diet is a low-fat diet, emphasizing low sodium, definitely with an alcohol consideration, maybe less focus on fish, whereas the Mediterranean diet is not low fat at all, right? We saw it 40%, it's probably closer to 35% now. Fish, not as much attention to sodium or alcohol. So very different styles of eating. And they are all, you know, a healthy way of eating. So there are a lot of ways to have a healthy diet. There's not one of these. And when you do analyses, epidemiologic analyses, and you score people with respect to a range of these different styles of eating, it really is remarkable how similar the results are. And so whether you're doing DASH or Mediterranean, the disease outcomes are often fairly similar from diets that in their components are can be somewhat different. Another reason I think that there's a lot of confusion is that there's increasing knowledge about nutrition. So we do always, and I think nutrition tends to get into the news a lot for better or worse. And when that happens, there's inevitably a simplification, right? But can you make sure someone can get in? Hi. So we continue to learn new things and refine our understanding. Many of the details, in the nitty-gritty lack consensus in the field. Though, again, I'm going to argue that we have high-level agreement because I'm talking about this myth that the foundational knowledge of nutrition changes a lot. Substitution is an important concept, and so it's really important to evaluate foods with respect to other likely options. So recently I heard I don't know where I heard it, who knows, this guy from Stanford, and somebody said, is a Beyond Burger, which I love, is a Beyond Burger healthy? And he was, because it's ultra processed, it's a totally processed thing. And the response is, well, compared to what? What are you going to eat instead? If you're going to eat, a sirloin steak versus, some kind of bean veggie thing that you make in your own kitchen. And so it's always important to think about, like, compared to what? What am I going to eat if I don't eat this? That's really how I think a lot of how it's good to consider a lot of these things. And we know that there's likely a lot of individual differences in how people respond to foods. So two people might be given identical diets and they have different response to those diets. And that's something that we're just beginning to explore more and really beginning to understand. It's a mission of the NRI. Despite all these new things that we keep learning, there are always going to be gaps. If you looked at the list of myths, every single one of those things would need to be studied. And science is slow and expensive, and it's never complete. And so to keep up with kind of like all the new products and all the new things, all the questions, that's difficult, and there's I would say, a fragmentation of information, and that doesn't just apply to diet, right? I mean, people, we've kind of lost, I'm sorry, do you see that? Oh, thank you. We kind of have decreased access to or use of some set of consistent sources of information. And so we get information from everywhere, and there's a great deal of interest in diet and nutrition things. And, what can we do to enhance our productivity or our energy or our longevity? There's a lot of online sources and often a heightened presentation, sensationalist, which I saw a lot when I looked at those lists of myths. Diet is extremely difficult to study in humans, and I'm going to say that there are two primary ways that we study diet. So I'm an epidemiologist, so I do observational studies. Deb is an experimental scientist. Observational studies are incredibly limited because it's hard to measure diet. We ask people what they ate. We ask people what they ate yesterday. That's limited by the fact that people's diets, to some extent, change day to day. So we have to ask them multiple days, or we ask them what on average they consumed over the past year. That's a very difficult cognitive kind of computation to do, especially when you're asking about something like tomatoes and you've got the lasagna and the pizzas and you're trying to report tomatoes. Many items of interest are not specified by people, so people aren't marking them. And if not enough people report, then we don't have sufficient numbers to really do a statistical analysis. Or many things are left off of the assessments that we use. So many assessments are list-based, and inevitably, if you ever look at these paper assessments, people will write in the margins because it's frustrating, that the list doesn't include something, that is a part of their diet. So I already talked about this. Dietary components are difficult to study analytically if only a small number of people report intake. And then the food system environment changes rapidly. And this is difficult it's challenging for research to keep up. It's hard to integrate all the new things into the assessment. On the back end, right, we have the nutritional information. And so there's inevitably a lag there. So how do we characterize that food or that dietary component with respect to the stuff that's in it? And then in terms of experimental studies, the allocation of food or diet to participants is rarely perfectly controlled unless you had people live, you contained them. You can't ask participants to consume. I think it's very challenging for participants to consume a food or diet for a long period of time. That's kind of outside what they're used to doing. And you have to think that sometimes people they have families, right? And ages ago, I heard that one of the reasons that women dropped out of the Women's Health Initiative was because they had to end up making 2 meals. They had to make their Women's Health Initiative meal, and then they had to make the meal for the rest of their family. And it's particularly difficult when you think about some of these longer term outcomes that we're interested in, like mortality, or a cardiovascular disease event, a heart attack, stroke, or cancer, to assess, to make a connection between diet and one of those outcomes means you have a long period of time. And so that's typically when you turn to an observational study. And many experimental studies have a relatively smaller sample size as compared to observational studies, and greater use of exclusion criteria. And so you might not be able to apply the results as broadly. And neither one of these designs have typically focused on ways that people may differ in response to food and diet. Again, that's the mission of the NRI, and NRI is involved. Deb is a PI of one of the clinical centers for the Nutrition for Precision Health study, which is this large-scale national effort to really understand better how people differ in their response to diet. There's an increasing role of industry and business in our diet, in part, and I think in part this addresses our increasingly busy and complicated lives. And so this chart on the bottom shows the increased number. The solid line is the increased number of prepared products between 2015 and 2019, and then the lighter line on the bottom is the percent of prepared foods that people are consuming. So you can see that even just from 2015, there's been this amazing, market increase in prepared foods in the market, and it's accounting for roughly twice as many calories. And in addition, there are a lot of introduction of ready-to-eat products and creation of food items into convenient and flavorful packets like bars and powders and drinks. And so this chart on the right, I just want to show a highlight. We'll get back to this chart later on because I know that you want to know about other things being displayed, but just to highlight here, this is from 1999 to 2018, the increase in ready to heat and ready to eat mixed dishes. So that's been, and this is the percentage of energy went from somewhere around 2.5% to about 12%. And admittedly, scientists and governmental agencies can contribute to confusion or inconsistency. So we're going to go through a little bit of the dietary guidelines and how those have changed over time. So in the early days, this was a low-fat message. And even then, we knew because remember, the 7-country study was what in like the mid-50s, 60s, and the first dietary guidelines for Americans came out in 1980. We knew that it was more complicated than that. We knew that type of fat was relevant, but there was a decision, my understanding from somebody who lived at the time and was a part of this study and part of the conversation, said that there was a decision that getting into fat subtypes was too much nuance for public recommendations. They knew that intake of saturated fat was higher than than ideal. And so, but they didn't think that they could have a message around saturated fat. So their message was around total fat. And so what happened was this led to greater intake of carbohydrates, which tended to be refined. And I would say an increase in the development of ultra processed foods. I don't know if people remember Snackwells. I think that's what they were called, those cookies. Yeah. But what was really wanted was a decrease in saturated fat specifically. And so now if you look at the current dietary guidelines, grains are minimized. There's a great deal of attention on ultra processed foods. And when you think about the ultra processed foods, a lot of grains today are ultra processed, or at least fit the definition of ultra processed. So almost all breads, pasta's refined, most rice that people consume is refined. And so cereals, breakfast cereals. And so what we want, and this is just a question, right? Are we kind of repeating something here? What we want is a shift from processed food to whole foods, foods in their natural form. And we're going to see how the public responds to this recommendation. But I don't know that it's true that we want people to decrease whole grain consumption. It's just that most grains consumed are not whole grains. So it's kind of similar to what we had in the low fat period. So these are, I just wanted you to see the fonts and design that were used in the 80s. But really a couple of things here. First of all, this is really nutrient based, right? Our dietary guidelines are, they say eat a variety of foods, but otherwise it's avoid too much fat, saturated fat and cholesterol. They talk about starch and fiber, sugar and sodium. And again, this really led to kind of a low fat kind of focus, despite the evidence from the 7-country study, that total dietary fat was not the most relevant. You could go up to 40%, and most of that fat was monounsaturated from olive oil. Or you could go down as low as 10%, like the Asian diets. There were some others. So what was going on before 1980s, right? Because I said that the 7-country study happened in the 50s and 60s, and then we have the first official dietary guidelines for Americas. So we have, Ansel Keys's work happening in the mid 1960s. One of the premier cardiovascular disease cohort studies started, the Framingham Heart Study. And this showed a positive association between circulating cholesterol and heart disease. And so you can see that in the upper figure, the solid line is cholesterol, and as you increase, quartiles, it's just as you go up, as you increase circulating cholesterol, your morbidity, so that's largely CVD events, increased. And we also knew these are distributional pictures of serum cholesterol. So with respect to the CHD and non-CHD, and you can see that the CHD dashed lines, their curve is shifted. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to show this is because it's always amazing, right? One of our primary risk factors, right? Circulating cholesterol. When you look at the distribution, there's enormous overlap. And it's the same thing with blood pressure. So this is why in public health, we have this kind of shift the curve notion, right? Because just a shift from the dashed to the solid distribution can make a huge difference in a population level cardiovascular disease rate. And so in 1977, there was a Senate committee on nutrition and human needs saying reduce total fat, saturated fat, calories, increase carbohydrates. So, and then we can see some of the trends looking retrospectively in a shift from protein to carbohydrates. And so this is the percentage of total energy on average consumed from fat in the blue and carbohydrates, I guess that's teal. And if you add them up, what you see is that protein really doesn't change. It's about 15% over time. And that tends to be true in most cultures. That protein is around 15 to 20%. And really what is happening with the substitution, in a natural kind of old school diets, what's happening is a substitution between fat and carbohydrates. And so if you compare the Japanese and the Greek diets, they are very similar with respect to protein. The Greeks have 40% fat. The Japanese participants had about 70% of their calories coming from carbohydrates. And so you can see that fat, the percent of energy from fat decreased, right, to a low in 1999, and carbohydrates increased. And over that same time period, so some people have attributed this change to the population level changes we've seen in obesity, right? Because this is what kind of changed it, and you did have a lot of refined grain, which is not as compared to whole grains. It doesn't always have the same satiety effect. And so you might consume more, plus greater production for, really tasty combinations of, sugar and salt, and, you eat more. But recently there's been renewed emphasis on fat subtypes, and I'm guessing most folks in this room understand fat subtypes. Is that true? You kind of know the difference between olive oil and butter, or saturated fat and monounsaturated fat. And so here there's a study, fairly recent study, doing something that Keyes did long ago, showing effects of dietary fat on circulating cholesterol, and they've included trans fat in yellow, which I think is no longer in the food supply. But you can see that the change in total cholesterol to HDL, decreases with the polyunsaturates in the purple and the blue, and doesn't really affect the saturates, or isn't really affected by saturated fat, and increases with trans. And what we've done in epidemiologic studies is we do the substitution models. And so we say, what happens if you substituted, 5% of your carbohydrates for 5% of saturated fat? So you decreased carbohydrates, you increased fats, specifically saturated fat. And so this is a chart of if you replaced the top thing with the bottom thing, and the outcome is hemoglobin A1C, which is a longer term measure of glycemic control. So the lower, the better. And what you see is replacing carbohydrates for saturated fats, you basically have no effect, but replacing carbohydrates for either of these other monos or polys, you see a decrease. And when you substitute saturates for monos and polys, you also see a decrease, but there's no change between monos and polys. And it's critical to recognize that this is an observational study. So carbohydrates here is total carbohydrates. And this is a study in the US. So what's the predominant form of carbohydrates consumed in the US? Refined, right? I'm not sure. So there are folks have gone in and tried to do something similar looking at carbohydrate quality, because do you think that necessarily increasing, our evidence from Japan would suggest that just increasing, substituting, taking out your carbs and increasing your monos and polys would always necessarily be a good thing, right? It depends on what your carbs are. And in the US, when you see carbs, we all know what that means, right? I mean, maybe some of us make oat groats and things, but so the next big shift, I would say, in our thinking is in 2015, the dietary guidelines moved from a focus on nutrients predominantly to a dietary patterns-based recommendations. And so these are overall styles of diet. This is like the DASH diet or the Mediterranean diet, any of those, they're dietary patterns. And an emphasis on whole foods, including high-fat foods, okay, avocados, olive oil. And what we've learned in nutritional epidemiology is that this is dietary patterns, because they capture an entire diet, as opposed to looking at specific nutrients or even specific foods. When you capture an entire diet like that, it's incredibly powerful statistically, and it's a very robust measure of diet. And so and this is just an example, if you study the Mediterranean diet and you see that it's associated with decreased diabetes, decreased heart disease, and then you go into the specific components, you might not see an association with any single one of the specific components, but taken together, that is really what impacts health. And so I think there's a recognition that we need to account to say whether diet has an effect. We need to account for whole diet. It's also very useful, I think, from a public perspective, because I think telling people about nutrients or specific foods, it's much easier, right, when you say, I don't know, you tell me, say these are some dietary ways of eating, styles of eating, DASH diet, Mediterranean, gives you a model for a more comprehensive eating style. And so this is just showing that as you go across levels of what's called the healthy eating index, you see lower hazard ratios for cardiovascular disease, CVD mortality, and all-cause mortality. And so that, I don't know if you can see the 0.84. Can people see these? No? Well, anyway, the higher you go in the healthy eating index, higher means you're more adherent to the healthy eating index. Higher is quote unquote healthier. The lower your disease risk, and highly statistically significant. Now, we've had another big change with the recent dietary guidelines, which really includes a focus on processed foods. And so limit highly processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates. And so you do have whole grains included, but it's down at the bottom. And I think, it would be, I would say, a simplification to say that it's not healthy to consume 70% of your calories from whole grains, like we see in some cultures, many cultures. But, we recognize that in the US, most grains are refined and processed. And so we have them sitting down there at the middle on the bottom. And this is, again, just that same figure, and this shows kind of the increase in various processed foods, particularly these ready to eat, but you've also got sweet snacks and sweet snacks, and sweets. Okay, bakery products, pizza's gone up. Other has gone up. Ready to heat and ready to eat. Some things have gone down. Sugar sweetened beverages, but we do have instead, and where did I see that? An increase in fast food or reconstituted meat, poultry, or fish. Now, processed foods, the individual processed foods, it's a fascinating paper, are not always associated with adverse health. So here we have breakfast cereals, which are going to be classified as ultra processed, and they are inverse. So here's this dashed line. If you see that these lines around the dot do not cross the dashed line, that means it's significant, statistically significant. If the dot and the lines are to the left of the dashed line, it means it's protective. And if it's to the right, you see that's increasing your risk. So sugar sweetened beverages, increasing your risk. Processed meat, increasing your risk. And then, but you see a decreased risk, specifically here with cold cereals. And it's fairly consistent, hard liquor for one of them. Anyway. And so you have to ask, whenever you do a food level analysis, right? Is it the processing? Is it the food? That's a huge question in this whole ultra processed food study, right? Because most of the foods that are processed are also probably foods that we would score lower on diet quality. So distinguishing those. And then whenever you look at a food analysis, you have to think of the substitution. So somebody eating cold breakfast cereal, they might have a super great diet. I mean, a bowl of, whatever, it's not telling you everything there is to know about their diet. And so I think there's a lot of remaining questions around ultra-processed foods and even defining ultra-processed foods, the fact that almost all yogurt and cold cereals and breads are ultra-processed. I mean, those can fit into a healthy diet. There is this fascinating paper that not everybody in the department likes, but this is, can I attain a healthy diet if I consume many UPFs? So this group, and I like this paper because I think it's an important question, because it acknowledges the reality, I think, of the current food system and the reality of people's lives. I think it is, a lot of these foods are convenient. Maybe some of them are less expensive. And so asking, is there a way in this food environment that we're in, busy people, maybe people of limited income or financial means, is there a way to still obtain a healthy diet that may include many UPFs? And they came up with, some, you probably can't read these, I'm sorry. They came up with some of these menus, 4 days of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack. And this is getting 80% of energy from ultra-processed food as based on the NOVA scoring system. And so we could have an entire session on the NOVA scoring session. But and so I thought that this was, I think this is another fruitful line of research and something that we need to spend, we need to acknowledge some kind of on the ground realities. So that was my talk on this one myth that I found in my scientific search review of nutrition myths. The myth is fundamental nutrition advice keeps changing a lot. So we did see, some changes, right? But I think it's all going in the same direction. Much of our understanding about what constitutes a healthy diet for most people has not changed greatly. And honestly, we knew many things in the 1950s. There's been a greater emphasis on quality, so really distinguishing fat subtypes and distinguishing carbohydrates with respect to fiber, whole grains, whole foods, increasing a focus on whole diet through dietary patterns. And I think I think there's some of this out in the world, but I think this notion of substitution and just saying, is this healthy? That's kind of simplistic, because it's, well, compared to what? What are you going to eat if not that? And what else are you eating? What's your whole diet? This is not to say that, we're done here. There are many unanswered questions, including how individuals differ in their response to diet. And I would say, including most of the myths that I did not talk about, they have not been researched. And I think particularly, I don't know if we go back to our slide, supplements got a lot of attention, and we know so little about, I think, supplements and what to tell people about supplements. And there are a ton of supplements out there. Timing was another big one, particularly about don't eat, what was it? One said, don't eat anything after 7 p.m., not even a grape. That was a myth. So I think a lot of around when we eat and what we eat, we need more research in that area. But yeah, I'd love to hear questions.
Yeah, we can open the floor for questions. We'll do in-person questions first, and then Brooke can cover the online questions that we have. So if anyone has anything.
I have a question. In the ultra-processed foods, where they were saying what would a healthy ultra-processed, can you just tell us an example day? Because we couldn't really see. And was the answer yes? And how did they define healthy for this? Like, was it
you would get an 80 out of 100 on the healthy eating.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yes, and you'd also, and this is, so there are two 80s.
Yeah.
80% of energy from ultra-processed, and this would get you at least an 80.
So as a comparison, if you know something like the Mediterranean diet is around that score. Yeah. So what would this?
You can have a breakfast burrito with egg whites, black beans, shredded cheddar, orange juice. You can have a turkey sandwich for lunch, whole wheat bread, deli turkey, tomato, romaine, mushrooms, shredded mozzarella, mustard, grilled potatoes, and a sparkling water. Dinner, salmon rice bowl, white rice, chopped scallions, cucumber, sesame seeds, mayonnaise, hot sauce, nori, steamed broccoli. And then your snack is a fruit cocktail. Other times you get a snack of roasted almonds, mandarin oranges, or raisins, or a yogurt. Other meals are, they've got a rotisserie chicken on here, pasta with meat sauce, spinach salad, spinach pasta bake, taco salad. Hot cereal is instant oatmeal with raisins. They have honey nut oat cereal. Bananas, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's yes.
With the powdered fiber, is the powdered fiber that's available now, you mix in drinks or whatever, any good, any bad?
Like Metamucil, kind of like a Metamucil product, or a Metamucil product, so mixing the fiber in a product like that? Is that your question?
Yeah, I can't speak, fiber, one of the myths was fiber is only important to stay regular. So, I think that, I don't think there's anything bad about, I think that's is that inulin, I think, fiber. And so I don't think it's bad, and it might be additionally good for your gut microbiome. I don't know the extent to which, so if you get fiber from a whole grain or a vegetable, it also, there's a lot of nutrients in there. And so I don't know how that works out, but yeah.
And supposedly the fiber also absorbs the bad cholesterol, or maybe
Yeah,
helps the good cholesterol.
right, especially the soluble, yes, so, yeah. Yep.
Did you hear any myths pertaining to like dairy alternatives?
I have my list of myths here. Plant milk is healthier than dairy milk. I think there's a lot of work to be done on milk, especially full fat milk. So this has been kind of in the literature for a while. A lot of people haven't, I think there was this notion that full fat milk, because it does have some saturated fat, we'd see that it was adversely associated, and people haven't. In fact, sometimes, there are a number of studies that have shown that it might be good for you. And so, and I think that is in the new dietary guidelines. I think there's a move away from low fat, just telling people to do low fat milk. There are potential, some of the fat soluble vitamins, yeah.
I think we'll jump into the online questions now. Brooke has a few.
Hi, Katie. So let's get started. When headlines report conflicting nutrition findings, where should people go to find the truth?
Well, I would say the primary literature, but that's probably not even feasible with I don't know if things are open access. So, it kind of depends. I've seen very good reporting where they do include, I feel like it used to be a little bit more one-sided. So they talk to an author, or maybe they talk to another researcher who had a similar view of things. But I feel like I also see more and more articles where they have a researcher tempering the finding a little bit. I think if it's a single study, I mean, one of the main things to always remember is that we need reproducibility. We, in studying humans, at least, would never make or would rarely make a proclamation based on a single study. You'd always want to see what we call a body of evidence. And so it is, in the papers, they tend to pluck out one study. And so I think, the reporter may or may not do a good job at pulling in kind of a well-rounded group of scientists to weigh in on it. But I think if you see things like this is consistent, but I think if there's a study and it's like, this is really, rocking the world because it's so different, then it's like, well, you want to see more studies that agree with that different finding. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Did that answer the question though?
Yes, I believe you answered the question. Our next question is, what's one piece of nutrition advice you feel confident will still be true 20 years from now?
Well, I still think the Mediterranean style of eating or the Japanese style of eating, and I'm not talking about current westernized. I think that these are, there's a group called Old Ways, and they kind of collect different styles of eating from around the world. So you'll have like South American, African, East Asian, Mediterranean. I feel like we're going to see that following a diet that focuses on whole foods is still, we're going to repeat Ansel Keys results forever. So, and I don't think it matters whether you want to do 40% fat or 15%. I know that's a general, but I really feel like that's, it's great that we know that. We have a range of healthy diets to choose from depending on taste, including vegetarian and cultures.
Excellent. Thank you. Another one, are there any studies suggesting that limiting people's portion sizes via shrinkflation can lead to positive long-term health outcomes?
Do you know that term, Deb?
What?
Shrinkflation?
No, that's when a quart of ice cream has suddenly become 3/4 of a quart of ice cream.
Well, I do think that, there's been a lot of work on kind of portion size and how it's changed over the decades. I don't know if you've seen any of these pictures. Some of them are just remarkable. I do think that we generally in the US consume more energy than we need. And so those kinds of, using a smaller plate, waiting 20 minutes, just kind of making sure that you're done when you've had enough. And so, yes, I think that I don't know if the question is about caloric restriction, that I'm not talking about, but yeah.
Thank you. And I will do one more. We have two that kind of cover the same thing. Do you have any books on nutrition and eating healthy that we could read that would be a good guide to follow?
I don't have, I can think about it and maybe we can send something out to the
Nourishing Your Tribe by Chris Lagrita's book is a pretty good one, but it's more geared towards families rather than single people. So it's how a mom might arrange her kitchen so it's better food.
Oh, that's very good.
Nourishing Your Tribe.
Nourishing Your Tribe, we've had a recommendation from an expert in the audience. I do not know this.
Excellent. Thank you. And then Carson, this is my last one. Any thoughts on inflammatory foods and identifying which foods are actually inflammatory?
This is such a hard one. There is this inflammatory diet index. I think some things, omega 3s, fish, some of the literature around what's potentially protective against inflammation. But then I read somewhere that Tom Brady doesn't eat red peppers or tomatoes because they're inflammatory. So that, I don't know about that. That I think is different ground, but I think fish and vegetables have been anti-inflammatory. I haven't stopped eating red peppers or tomatoes.
I'll probably continue to eat this one. Thank you so much. That was very informative. And comforting to know that this more simplistic recommendation of like eating patterns and types of cuisines is what's recommended right now. That makes me feel better about how I can improve my diet. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for those that joined in person and joined online. We hope that our discussion today provided useful tools for evaluating nutrition claims. We'll also be putting all of the slides and graphs and links to some certain things that Dr. Meyer referenced on our AFL page, and we'll send that out to everyone that attended today, so you can look more deeply into all of the graphs and things. We invite you to join us for future Appetite for Life programs. You'll receive a survey after this program, and I hope that you'll take just a few minutes to fill it out. Let me know if this was something that's interesting to you, if you have an idea or an appetite for life in the future. We just want to provide the most engaging programs that we can for you. And finally, the Nutrition Research Institute is a nonprofit organization. We're supported by grants, by partnerships, and philanthropy. So if you're interested in supporting our research and community programming like this, you can visit us at uncnri.org/support to learn more about that. Thank you for your time and for your engagement, and thank you, Dr. Meyer, for a wonderful presentation.